So I have to say, before we get started, that having a show is one thing. Having a show with an introduction like that requires you to bring your game to such a higher level. I hope that the production quality of our intro matches the quality of the content after the fact.
I'm almost certain that it won't.
That's the spirit right there. That's the spirit right there. Nevertheless, Penn State is coming off of a 29-7 victory over Indiana this past weekend. Preparing now for a trip to Columbus to take on the top-ranked team in the country, the Ohio State Buckeyes, as everybody knows, defending national champs. Before we get to that game, thinking about last week, in a lot of ways, we keep saying this over and over again, but this was probably Penn State's most complete game on both sides of the ball. The defense, to a certain extent, has really never had an off game this season. But the offense looked complete. Christian Hackenberg's throwing for 2 touchdowns, both 39 yards, which I thought was an interesting statistic, and then running for 2 more. It was the first time in a long time that Hack has looked like Hack. The first time in a long time that Penn State's receivers have gotten open, made some separation. And I think to a certain extent, it was one of the better games that John Donovan has called as an offensive coordinator. Now, some of that, I think, you watch this game and you go, well, how have they not looked this good all season? And on the other hand, you go, well, maybe the rain really does make a difference to a certain extent, that when it's really crappy out, it's hard to play good-looking football. And I think you get a little bit of both of that. I think they're getting better as a team, and I think at the same time, it always helps when you're just playing on grass and you're not worrying about getting rained on, because it's not even like it's just sort of rained on Penn State this season. Like, every time it's rained, it's been just unbelievably enthusiastic about the precipitation taking place over State College. So
enthusiastic and persistent for all 4 quarters.
Yeah, it's not even a passing moisture moment. This is just a deluge. That's a good word right there. It's 50-cent word. Yeah, well, it's part of bringing up the quality of the content. But what did you see this past weekend?
I mean, I think the most important thing to note about Penn State's offense was that they did what they did without Akil Lynch or Saquon Barkley playing football. They had a couple of inexperienced young guys carrying the football for the majority of the game, or for the entire game, and they were still able to put up 29 points. I think if you compare it to Rutgers, that's probably the more complete of the 2 games. Just because Joey Julius's 2 extra points sort of take away some points from...
Yes, quite literally, too, to be exact.
From that phase. So the offense and defense put together a very complete game. Special teams wasn't bad in terms of kickoffs, returns, all that stuff, but Joey Julius missing a couple extra points sort of knocks them down a peg. But like you said, overall it was at least a more complete game in that they were playing a better team than Rutgers is.
Yeah, and I think there was a big question going into that game whether Penn State was going to be able to find all the pieces to that puzzle to play Indiana, and certainly Indiana was banged up at quarterback all game coming into the game, had some injuries that it had to deal with, but anytime you play a team that is really one play away from beating Ohio State, or really any team that's one play away from beating the #1 team in the country, you have to take very seriously coming into that game. And Penn State, I didn't pick Penn State to win that game. I know I did. We have a whiteboard where we all picked before the season started. I know that I picked Penn State to win that game before the season started, but watching how the 2 teams were sort of trending, just headed into that week based off of the last game, it was hard to see Penn State winning, and they proved me wrong. It wasn't even really ever close. I mean, Indiana got that 1 score to answer Penn State's opening score, but other than that, the defense did what Penn State's defense has done so well really for the past few years, and the offense made enough plays throughout the course of the game to pick up the victory. So that's all for that week, and now Penn State turns their focus towards Ohio State. So shifting away from Penn State's game against Indiana, the Nittany Lions are headed to Columbus this weekend to face Ohio State, as everyone already knows. And it's one of those things where Penn State has a lot of big games on the schedule. You can say that the games against Michigan State, the games against Michigan, the games against Ohio State, those are the big opportunities. I think the big games in terms of what you can do with taking a step forward with your season, those are the games against Indiana and Maryland and Illinois. That's not as glamorous, but you need to win those games to make progress. And I think that's what makes this kind of an interesting weekend, because Penn State, everybody that you talk to seems very loose. There's not a lot of like extra stress going into this kind of thing. It's sort of a you've got nothing to lose situation. No one expects you to win, and it's a big opportunity. And I think that's the difference between a big game and a big opportunity. Is it's one of those things where when no one expects you to win and you lose, it's not a big deal. I mean, certainly Penn State's trying to avoid putting losses in the loss category at every opportunity. Winning is always better than losing, and we've talked about that before. But certainly, I think you get the feeling, talking to people around the program, that you just sort of go in there and give them your best shot and move on from there. And it's going to take Penn State's best shot to beat Ohio State. I think what's made Ohio State such a good team is not so much that the Buckeyes are blowing people out, because they really aren't. It's that teams stay close, and then somewhere around the late third quarter, Ohio State starts wearing you down, starts making those big plays, and starts pushing ahead. And I think you saw that last week. Ohio State and Maryland are tied, midway through the third quarter, and Ohio State, ends up winning that game 49-28. And you go from a game where everyone goes, well, this is a lot closer, they're on upset watch, and you get all the banners on the bottom of your TV, to a game where Ohio State, essentially dominates in the second half and runs away with it. So I think
sitting there at Beaver Stadium, they announce, Dean DeVore announces to the crowd that it's 21-all Ohio State Maryland in the third quarter, and the crowd erupts. And I don't know, half an hour later, I asked the guy sitting behind me who has his phone working what the score of the game was, and he goes, oh, it's 42-21 Ohio State. So they very quickly put up 3 straight scores on what was a close game, and that's essentially what they've done.
Yeah, and that's what makes them so deadly. I mean, you talk about Ohio State, and it's not really a secret what they bring to the table. You have Braxton Miller at wide receiver now, who James Franklin says, and I think is accurate to say, looks like he's been playing wide receiver for his whole career, even though this is his first season at that position. You've got Ezekiel Elliott, who's a guy that came into the season with a lot of Heisman hype. Ohio State has not always used him maybe like people expected, so his numbers, I mean, are definitely reflective of a good running back, but maybe not that sort of like national powerhouse statistics. But I think without a doubt, Ezekiel Elliott is one of the best running backs in the country. And his ability to get to the second level and then just run past everyone is really, it's sort of like he doesn't show up for the whole game and then he runs for 70 yards and Ohio State wins. And that right there is the sort of thing that you can't really prepare for. You just have to keep playing defense and just hoping that you are in the right place at the right time. To their credit, to Penn State's defense's credit, last year when they played Ohio State, the longest run that Elliott had all game was just 12 yards. So you like Penn State's chances to pretty much every time they face a running back, Penn State has usually been able to hold them within reasonable amount of gaining on any given play, but without a doubt it's difficult to do against Elliott.
And I mean, and then you add in the fact that you have J.T. Barrett, the quarterback that beat Penn State at Beaver Stadium last year, playing with some sort of quasi-quarterback, running back, wildcat type role where he's still getting carries. They have 3 guys who started at quarterback for them, all playing on offense, only one of them actually playing quarterback now, and all 3 of them scoring touchdowns. Not necessarily in the traditional way that you would expect a quarterback to. I think their defense is more beatable than their offense is. They've been known this season to let teams score some points on them, and that's something that Penn State's certainly capable of. The issue is slowing down what is a pretty prolific and very unique offense. Not too many teams face offenses that have,
so many weapons.
Cardell Jones and Braxton Miller and Ezekiel Elliott and J.T. Barrett. There's not one guy you can focus on, because if you do focus on that one guy, the other one's going to beat you. Yeah,
and I think you talked about J.T. Barrett. Ohio State, after 5 weeks, was ranked 121st in red zone offense, which is kind of remarkable when you think about it, just because of the amount of talent that they have on the field. And Urban Meyer goes and puts J.T. Barrett in as their quarterback in the red zone, and it's worked out really well for them. Last week they scored six touchdowns while they were in the red zone, which was basically how they went about beating Maryland. But I think, like you said, the fact that Barrett's he's dangerous on his feet. His legs can do a lot of the damage all on his own, or all on their own, rather. Plus, he's a smart guy. He's throwing the ball. He knows what he's doing. So you have a guy down in an area where everything's much more compact. It takes much faster decision-making processes and really just having to go. I think making that switch is the sort of thing that's really benefited Ohio State. And that's the advantage you have when you have a boatload of talent, that you can kind of play around with it a little bit and figure out how things are going to work. It's not like Penn State's going to put Tommy Stevens in the red zone to see what he can do. That's not a benefit. They're an asset that every team in the country has. How do I think the game is going to go? I think we haven't talked much about this, but I imagine we have similar sorts of thoughts, and maybe we'll find out because then I'll ask you. I think Penn State keeps it close for probably 3 quarters, like most teams have this year. I think it comes down to whether Penn State can move the ball, and certainly if Saquon Barkley is back this week, if Hackenberg starts out strong and the receivers can get some separation, there's no reason that Penn State can't hang with Ohio State for a while, but it's just going to take too many things going Penn State's way for 4 quarters against a really good team playing at home in a game that they need to win just to keep their undefeated streak, their undefeated season, #1 standing. It's just hard to see Penn State winning this game, barring a lot of events that are just difficult to see actually happening in the real world, even if they're technically possible.
Yeah, to answer your question, we do have pretty similar thoughts. I think that it's not going to be a blowout. I know the spread's at 17, the last that I saw, and I do expect Penn State to cover that. Don't yell at me next week if you lose money listening to that advice.
Don't gamble on Penn State football.
No,
Ever.
Never.
You shouldn't gamble to begin with, but especially on Penn State football.
Right. So I think Penn State will keep it closer than that. I think it's 14-point or less Ohio State victory when all is said and done. But I think it's a game that Penn State's capable of winning. Do I think they will win? No. But I think they'll play well enough that it'll give you a lot of hope for what this team's future holds.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know what the final spread will be. I can see this very much being a game where Penn State's down 14-7 at halftime or something like that, and Penn State just can't score enough points in the second half to answer some Ohio State scores, and you end up with a final score much like the Maryland game that's farther spread out than maybe the game actually played out. But like you said, I don't think it'll be a blowout. It's not going to be another 64 to whatever Penn State scored that last time that they were out there. But it should be interesting. It's always fun to watch these games unfold because you don't cover a team that's trying to take down the #1 team in the nation very often. It certainly happened with Penn State and Ohio State the past couple of years, but in general, it's always sort of a unique opportunity.
Well, if logic tells you anything, Indiana almost beat Ohio State and we killed Indiana. So if you put 2 and 2 together, Penn State should win this game.
Yeah, the transitive theory has never been proven wrong in sports ever before.
Never.
So
No.
I believe it. Penn State's going to win because they beat Indiana.
Yeah.
So before we go, we're sort of answering Twitter questions today. We've sort of averaged out the most commonly asked ones because everyone basically wants to know the same 3 or 4 things this week. The first one is basically what are the keys to victory? We sort of already went over this, but basically Penn State's defense has to be strong when it's on the field and has to not be on the field for the whole game. Actually, I said this in a podcast that I did with some Ohio State people earlier this week, that in the second and third quarters of last year's game, Ohio State had the ball for over 20 minutes, which when you only have 30 minutes to work from in that same span is a lot of time to keep your defense on the field in a game that you're trying to keep close. So Penn State can't do that, especially on the road. The offense has to move the ball, and it's going to have to move the ball early. It's not going to be able to get away with the 17-0 sort of lead that Ohio State could put up and then try and come back. Maybe that works at home from time to time, but that's not any way to try and go out and win a game.
Yeah.
So the offense has to move the ball and has to move it early, and the defense has to play like the defense has all year and stay off the field as much as it can. The next question is basically, does Saquon Barkley play? We don't know. The doctors have decided, but no one will tell anyone what the doctors have decided. One would have to imagine, though, that if they've decided this early in the week, which it's Thursday now, but we found out yesterday on Wednesday that they had decided that either he is so far from recovered that he's not going to play, and they already know it, or he is far enough along in his recovery that he's been cleared to play. And the fact that he's practicing for the second straight week, we saw him, his limbs appear to be attached, and he's good at walking and running. One would be able to assume that he's going to play this weekend, but nobody knows.
Yeah, you said it all.
I did. I said it all. I tried.
I'm also leaning towards the latter of the 2 options, and those being First, that he's so far removed, the latter being that he is probably ready to play.
I think he is probably ready to play some competitive football again.
Don't gamble.
Don't
if
gamble.
You're going to gamble that Saquon Barkley's playing.
That's probably not a prop bet anywhere, but if it was, well, what if we opened a book, had statecollege.com bookie services? This is escalating quickly. And the last question, essentially, is does Joe Julius stay on as Penn State's kicker? Tyler Davis came in, hit a 30-some-odd yard field goal. Might have actually just been 30 yards. 30-yard field goal, made his extra point after Julius had missed both his extra points, which is kind of amazing, actually. I mean, Julius has kind of a weird sort of chip shot kick that I suppose could lead to some variations in its success. But James Franklin has said, yes, he's going to be their kicker. If they had to play right now, right today, right at this very moment, which is 12:14 p.m. on a Thursday, Joey Julius would be playing as Penn State's kicker.
And missing an extra point is, you almost have to try. Being that close to the goalposts, you need to kick it at a really wide angle to miss one. Neither of them were tipped. It was just the angle was so poor. They had the distance. The angle was just so poor on both of them that they missed. So I guess the answer is yes, he will be the kicker for the time being, but one more missed extra point, and I'm not sure how much longer that goes on for.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Sam Ficken story kind of makes everything a little more awkward nowadays because you go, well, you should yank him because he's missing extra points, and then you watch sort of the trajectory that Sam went on, going from a guy who couldn't make anything to a guy that was probably the most automatic aspect of Penn State's offense last year. So you kind of have to ride it out. And frankly, Tyler Davis might be good, but there's probably not a really big variation between the two qualities that those guys bring to the table, so you just let it happen. Certainly, Penn State can't afford to be making or missing extra points in a game against Ohio State.
Yeah.
Although I am all for Big Toe making big kicks in the shoe. So whatever it takes for that headline to get written, I'm all for. But those are our questions, summarized down quite nicely. So thanks for sending those in. For Zach Berger, a guy who sometimes watches TV on his couch in sports, I'm Ben Jones. And we will see you guys next week as Penn State prepares for a trip to Baltimore to take on Maryland at M&T Bank Stadium. But that is ways down the road, so we will see you guys next week for now. And we're off to Columbus.